Welcome everyone who's watching this. Sorry, we experienced some tech issues today and we could not go live, but we still managed to have the conversations that we had planned to have. And I hope that you managed to watch this video and enjoy the performance and poetry and the conversations. This event was co-hosted by Indian Cultural Forum and the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions India chapter. And I will pass over to Apoorva, who is a Palestine Solidarity champion, who is also co-organized this event with me.
Thanks for that, Aparna. We are here today to mark 10 years of the Indian campaign for academic and cultural boycott of Israel. To just put it in perspective, that the Palestinian campaign started 15 years ago. A few years after that, writers, eminent writers, activists, academics, and artists started the Indian chapter for it. And since then went on to have many noted victories. And are active even today, not just challenging Israel's interventions, cultural interventions in India, but also building a strong cultural collaboration with Palestine, as you will see today. We will start just in a bit, but I just want to read out this one line from the pledge, the InCACBI pledge that was launched 10 years ago, which kind of puts into perspective why the campaign is doing what it's doing. In a reality in which the Israeli state daily tramples on the academic freedom and cultural life of the Palestinian people, a continued association with the instruments of such a state is unconscionable. And today, as we remember this and as we mark 10 years of this campaign, we have a series of things for you lined up. This after I finish, now we'll have three videos. One from Geeta Hariharan, who's one of the founders of InCACBI, one from Omar Barghouti, who's the co-founder of the BDS movement, and one from Alia Malak, who's part of the Palestinian campaign for academic and cultural boycott of Israel. After these videos, we'll have Pushpamala, a visual artist from India, talking about the early experiences of organizing for InCACBI, stories from that time. Following Pushpamala, we'll have Achin Vanaik, Nivedita Menon, and Pamela Philipose in a conversation talking about two apartheids, the growing ties between India and Israel. And Aparna can tell you about the other part of this event after this.
Following this, we will, without feeling gloomy about the recent friendships between India and Israel, we will want to send a resounding response to also showcase how cultural solidarities in the recent times have developed between Palestinian artists and Indian artists, be it in the form of theatre collaborations or artistic collaborations. And for this, we have Sudhanva Deshpande from the Jana Manch theatre group, amateur theatre group in Delhi, and Orijit Sen, who is a visual artist, talking about their experiences of such collaborations. Finally, we also have poetry on and for Palestine being performed by Jana Manch. This is excerpts from Ujle Safed Kabutar, and you will hear poetry of Mahmood Darwish, Nisar Kabani, and Adanya Shibli.
So next up now are the three videos that I mentioned earlier. And after that, we will have Pushpamala.
One was the historical thread, both in West Asia as well as in India. In West Asia, the fragmentation that was caused by the colonial powers of the day, and in India, the solidarity, I won't use the word solidarity, the view of Palestine and therefore the view of Israel that grew out of the freedom movement and later the non-aligned movement's desire to decolonize by pursuing independent policies. So that is a historical thread. And then three other threads, more recent ones. One, of course, is the closer ties. We've spoken of the military ties. There are commercial ties, academic ties, cultural ties, but at the heart, the military ties. And the military ties as linked with strategic relations. The third point is the current situation in Palestine, and several of our contributors who have been to Palestine spoke of this, not only about the West Bank and Gaza, but within Israel, about the layers of erasure that exist over and above the layers of discrimination, the layers of violence. And finally, of course, the parallel threads of solidarity. Why solidarity? And there, I think, the central point that emerged was that for India to express solidarity with Palestine is actually for India to express solidarity with a certain notion we had of what India is all about. And that is, if you like, simplistically put, the why. And the how, of course, is even harder. But that, again, some of the suggestions made are, of course, pressurizing not only academic and cultural institutions in India and media, industry, and so on to eschew business as usual with Israel, but most of all to pressure the Indian government to put an end to military ties.
In the first panel on Gaza, I spoke about the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, BDS, as giving hope to Palestinians everywhere, especially under siege in Gaza. The reaction from the more than 1,500 people in the audience was overwhelming. Excellent responses, excellent questions, especially by young Indian students and young professionals. So it was a very lively discussion and a very positive vibe, I felt. And I felt a certain thirst for more information about BDS in particular, especially the fact that it's a human rights movement that is anchored in international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has no sectarian, religious, ideological identity. That surprised many people and interested many people. I can address this on several planes. First, the first point you mentioned, which is the sense of international solidarity. We're talking about Indians. I mean, they were not following, they were leading international solidarity in so many causes around the world, be it South Africa or every progressive cause on earth. India was at the forefront of the non-aligned movement, and it led international solidarity in many causes, and it played an extremely important role. So there's this sense that this international solidarity is needed on a moral level to start with. But beyond morality, I think it's very important for an average Indian. In Jaipur, I had several discussions with young, brilliant students who were arguing, playing devil's advocate, saying, you know, some might say Israel is a powerful country, India wants to become powerful, and so it's only natural to build this military relationship, very intimate military relationship, intelligence, homeland security relationship with Israel to gain from Israel's techniques and technology and experience. And I said, is this the model you want India to follow? You want India to become such a racist, intolerant, apartheid state? That's the last thing you need in India. So that's first. A second point is that an average Indian citizen, I'm sure, would rather see those billions of dollars invested in healthcare, in education, in creating jobs, in infrastructure development, not in buying useless weapons that cannot solve any problem. Billions of dollars that India is investing in weapons, a lot of it coming from Israel. Israel is making a killing out of Indian expenditure on the military. Is that useful for the 99% of Indian society? Absolutely not. It's beneficial for the 1% on top who are benefiting from this militarization of Indian society. It cannot possibly be in the best interest of the absolute majority of Indians. So the question of Palestine is a moral issue, yes. As Professor John Dugard of South Africa said, it's the litmus test for human rights around the world today. It's the test whether international law will succeed or fail. If it fails the Palestinians again, then no one in the global south will have any interest in this legal system that was established by the United Nations. But it's also an intersectional issue. Our interests and the interests of most Indians intersect. We have an interest that India shifts this massive investment into social investment rather than militarization. And of course, it serves Indian interests as well.
Many leading cultural and academic figures from India have organized and lent their names to the campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, part of the non-violent BDS movement for Palestinian rights. This has emerged from decades of solidarity Indian people have shown towards the Palestinian people. The last 5 or 6 years have been very challenging in the world, including in India, where under the right-wing regime, India's founding principles of democracy and secularism have been pulled apart, and any challenges to this have been punished. In such times, Indian civil society and the cultural community have not only fought their battles bravely, they have incorporated the struggle for justice in Palestine with their own. And this becomes necessary because India is increasingly looking at apartheid Israel as a model of militarism, supremacy, and racism against the racialized others. Through all this, InCACBI and other Palestine solidarity activists have challenged growing efforts to co-opt culture to whitewash and justify the crimes of both states, rooted in an alliance between the racist ideologies of Hindutva and Zionism. They have launched successful BDS campaigns asking major stars to refrain from whitewashing or artwashing oppression and to respect the Palestinian picket line by refusing to perform in apartheid Tel Aviv. They have continued affirmative engagement with Palestinian cultural resistance, of which this event is an example. InCACBI has, in the last decade, organised boycott campaigns on cultural events sponsored by Israel's far-right government and its complicit institutions and lobby groups. Together, we have celebrated victories, including convincing renowned tabla player Zakir Hussain to cancel his performance in Israel, and the acclaimed Mera Ner's boycott of Haifa International Film Festival. More recently, InCACBI's efforts have highlighted the use of culture as a tool of the fanatic ideological alliance bringing India and Israel together. After InCACBI had urged Bollywood film stars to not perform in Israel, 2 scheduled events in Israel involving these stars were cancelled or indefinitely postponed. InCACBI has also worked towards building cultural exchanges with Palestinian artists and cultural practitioners. The Palestinian-led global BDS movement, which InCACBI is part of, calls for boycotts of institutions, not individuals, based on complicity, not identity. We look forward to continuing to work with InCACBI in challenging complicity and oppression between India and Israel in the academic and cultural fields. We also hope that the appeal to the mainstream Indian film industry to not collaborate with Israel's complicit film institutions will continue to take concrete forms. Along with these, we hope to see more affirming and positive cultural ties between India and Palestine. In the period ahead, this intersection of our struggles will become even more necessary as apartheid Israel moves towards further annexation of occupied Palestinian territories, and India, Israel's biggest military customer, intensifies its repression of progressive movements at home. In building this resistance together lies the core of our principled connection and morally consistent solidarity.
Now I invite Pushpamala to talk about the early experiences of organizing for InCACBI. So Pushpamala, can we have you on?
Well, first, I live in Bangalore. So though I've been one of the early people involved with InCACBI, I've been mainly in Bangalore. So when Apoorva asked me to talk about the history of InCACBI, and practically every day something's been happening, I said I can't do that because I was not there on the spot all the time. And so I can talk about some of the things that I have organized or I've been a part of, and which happened in Bangalore. And there's some interesting stories and some very funny incidents around that. So InCACBI was set up in 2010, and they sort of convinced me to be a convener. And then what happened in 2011 was several of the Indian artists were invited for a major show in the Tel Aviv Museum. It was called Deconstructing India, and it was supposed to be the first major show of Indian art in Israel, in the newly built new wing of the Tel Aviv Museum. And it was the opening show, so it was supposed to be a very prestigious event. I thought we should boycott it. So I sent out a boycott letter. I mean, a letter asking for my artist friends to boycott it, which I sent around to my artist list. And something very funny happened, because apparently group of journalists meet once a week in Koshis in Bangalore, and then they discuss what the latest news is. So those guys found out about this email. I mean, we hadn't even sent a letter, a formal letter to the press yet. And the next day I found this on the front page of Bangalore Mirror with a picture of me that got from the net, and says, it says, Bangalore artists asked for boycott of Tel Aviv show. So then what happened was it caught on like wildfire. And I'll tell you a little bit of the history of this, because from, I think, post-liberalization, the art scene has only been talked about in terms of the art market. In fact, all reviews have stopped, and it's just either any art material, news is always in lifestyle, or it's in art market sort of articles. But what happened with this was that all over India, there was a huge sort of discussion going on in the art world, which went on for several weeks on Facebook and emails and so on. And like we were all writing to each other, and then also like, all the criticisms I was sort of researching and writing back and so on. Then the curators were angry and they wrote a letter, then I wrote a letter back and so on. And the press actually picked up all this, and it was widely covered in India as well as internationally, because it also came in, on TV and the press in Palestine as well as in Israel. And also otherwise, in some other international publications. So this is very interesting. And this whole, what happened was not many artists supported the boycott. I think 4 of us decided to boycott, and the rest decided to show, be part of the show. And the argument was, I think it's politically naive, that then we'll have to boycott every place in the world, and we're all showing all over the world, starting from India, because we all disapprove of so many things that are happening in each country. But anyway, what happened with all this hullabaloo is that one of the things that was attacked was the curatorial note about the show, and the title, which was Deconstructing India. So what these people wanted to do was, we had to deconstruct India, but Israel was not being deconstructed. And the histories of Israel and India were sort of seen as parallel because of the partition, and one felt it was not parallel at all. It was completely different, what happened. And so there was this whole attack on this curatorial note and this thing of deconstructing India, particularly to the public of Israel. And so, of course, all of us did very critical work, of what was happening over here. And so one felt that was not fair and quite ridiculous. So the show finally happened, but it was, I think, much more low key. And the name of the show was changed to what is it called? Critical Mass. So then the whole curatorial note was about artists in India using different kinds of materials and so on, So that was a very interesting, intervention, or successful, I would say, in the early years of InCACBI, when what happened with this boycott was that the whole art scene was sort of charged. And there was so much discussion going on about this, and also in the media. So another very interesting thing that happened was in 2014, when the Israeli consulate over here, which was just set up in 2013, it was just a year old, decided to have a major Israeli film festival. So, which was to showcase Israeli culture and so on to India. And this was in collaboration with the oldest film club in Bangalore, which is the Bangalore Film Society. So they had planned, it was a large thing, and it was going to happen in several venues in different parts of Bangalore. So this was not something that I initiated, but the protest, I told Delhi InCACBI about the Israeli Film Festival. I just found out about it in the last minute, just the day before. So they quickly wrote a letter, and of course I was one of the signatories, but they put my signature right on top because I was from Bangalore. So then I sent it around to the press over here, because I obviously had all the details of the emails of the press in Bangalore. So again, the next day, there was this huge article, I think again in Bangalore Mirror, which said local artists asked for protests against Israeli Film Festival, asked for boycott or something like that. So I was really a bit furious about that, because I didn't want to be, made so prominent once again. And so something funny happened. Though there was no physical protests at all in any of the sites, and it was just a kind of a protest letter that was sent to the press. Apparently, the Israeli consulate got so afraid about this protest that they asked for bomb squads to go around and examine all these venues. So my friends told me that they saw these policemen with the dogs, sniffer dogs, in all the venues of this film festival, which was actually going on. But then that was also a very successful protest, because after that, I've not seen, I don't think there has been any Israeli major festival, Israeli festival in Bangalore. I think they tried to have it the next year, but it was a small thing, limited to one venue. So that was a very interesting experience about the Israeli Film Festival. Then there have been other activities over here, like in 2014, we hosted Ben Rivers from the Freedom Theatre, and who gave a talk in my friend's artist space called One Shanti Road, and it had a packed audience, and again, many journalists were there, and there was a lot of discussion which went on for, I think, several hours. That was a nice thing that happened, because I think what this whole thing about Palestine is, there's a very strange conventional view, of amongst the public, even people who might be sympathetic, they don't really know what's going on over there and the exact situation, because nothing much is there in the press or in the media. And while Israeli publicity is everywhere, and one thing I must say is that why is the Israeli consulate in Bangalore? Because normally most of the consulates in the south are in Chennai, but Israel is doing a lot of collaboration with the Karnataka government. So they're in agriculture, they're in IT, they're everywhere, And in fact, one of my I think uncles who used to be in the Air Force, he said that the Indian government was actually collaborating with Mossad even during the IPKF days, apparently. And another, the most recent thing was Freedom Jata, which was in 2016. And which, of course, Sudhanva will be talking about, because Jana, Natya, Manch invited Freedom Theatre to come to India, and they traveled around to several different places. And in Bangalore, it was hosted by Samudaya, which is the oldest and most important left theatre, started just before the emergency in the 1970s, and whose heyday was actually in the 70s and 80s, when it had about, I think, 50, 60 branches all over Karnataka, and was extremely active, but they're also active today. So several of us, the artists, also participated in this, which was a week-long sort of event, and organized in the main art school over here in Chitrakala Parishad. We organized a kind of a poster workshop, in which all the students did research on their own about the whole situation, and made nice posters. And the Kannada poet Mamta Sagar also did a workshop for protest poetry and with them. And and then we had, I think, Geeta Hariharan's talk on this whole issue in again in Manch Road, and we had several of these events in connection with the Freedom Jata, film screenings and so on, and performances also on the day of the events. So I think, yes, I think that's what I would like to say. I just wanted to bring the thing, InCACBI alive, because it's also a lot of, besides like sort of, I think sometimes I get very irritated because every day we're signing a petition, or we are, sending off these letters of protests and all that. And it's just sometimes we forget some of these, amusing or piquant sort of stories about what happened. And I was just telling Apoorva that it'd be nice to have an archive, because I can't remember everything that has happened, and I'm sure no one can, because so many things have happened in the last 10 years. And I think if someone wants to do research, or for us to actually look back and see what all has happened, because it's BDS and InCACBI in India has been, I think, very active, and also in writing to artists and cultural figures not to take part in events in Tel Aviv. I think one of those things which was a bit of a flop was when we wrote to Amitav Ghosh not to accept the award from the Israeli university, but he went ahead and did accept the award and so on. But I think some of the cultural figures have actually heeded the call and not taken part or cancelled some of their whatever event in Israel. So I think that's all I have to say at this point. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for that, Pushpamala. What we know for sure is that there has always, from most parts of the political spectrum in India, there's always been a sense of solidarity with Palestine, except from the Hindutva forces. And we have seen this as a part of a broader anti-imperialist struggle as well. But this has changed in the last 7-8 years or so, and we've seen growing affinity with the Israeli government. I will now invite Pamela Philipose to moderate a conversation between Nivedita Menon and Achin Vanaik to discuss what the implications of this growing affinity are and where we can examine it.
Thank you, Aparna. Thank you, Apoorva. Thank you, Pushpamala, for that very nice and interesting talk that you took us through, because most of the action is focused Delhi and Bombay and so on. So it was nice to have that perspective from Bangalore come in. So thank you very much for that. In 1997, when Edward Said came to India, I had interviewed him. And what strikes me about that conversation is that so much of what he said remains with us. He said, and I quote him, "I think we Palestinians probably have the hardest fight of all before us. We have no strategic allies. The Arab countries around us are very, very shifty. A country that might support you at one time may a week later massacre your people. So we have no steady support of the region. Second, we had alliances which no longer exist. Third, we are not only fighting Israel, a nuclear power. And finally, they have the support of the United States." So those were his words. I close quotes here. One of the alliances that Israel once had was that with India. That changed dramatically along with the transformation of the Indian state under a Hindu majoritarian authoritarian prime minister. Narendra Modi's 3-day visit to Israel in 2017 during which he studiedly left out Ramallah from his itinerary, shows how deeply the Indo-Palestine relationship has been skewed in favor of Israel. It is in this context that we are discussing the important theme, two apartheids, growing affinity between India and Israel. And joining me is Nivedita Menon, JNU professor, and Achin Vanaik, retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. Both have visited Palestine, written extensively on Palestine, and have long engaged with the Palestinian question. So I'm delighted to welcome them to this conversation. Nivi, can I start with you? Talking of the two apartheids, do you see parallels between Israel's disenfranchisement of Palestinians and the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Indian Parliament passed into law last December?
Thank you, Pam. Yes, of course, I do see those parallels. And it might appear that on the surface that Israel is an occupying force and India is a democratic country. But if we look very briefly at the way in which Israel has functioned vis-a-vis Palestine, we will see some very alarming parallels, particularly from May 2019, when the Hindu Rashtra agenda has been pushed quite aggressively after the BJP came back to power. So I would like to go back to the 15th of May, 1948, which is Nakba, or the day of catastrophe for the Palestinians, and the day that the State of Israel was born. And to remind ourselves, because we need to remind ourselves again and again about the supreme injustice that Palestinians have faced and Palestine as a land has faced, because while Jews faced anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in Europe, the land that was given to them was Palestine, not Europe, not Poland, not Germany, where the concentration camps were run. And the reason why Israel was given this land, of course, is because it was promised to them by God in the Old Testament. And Zionism is the claim to Israel as the exclusive homeland of the Jews. So I think we need to see Zionism as a kind of companion ideology to anti-Semitism. In other words, to be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Semitic, just as to be anti-Hindutva is not to be anti-Hindu, or to be anti-Taliban is not to be anti-Muslim. I feel that these very simple truths need to be asserted again and again, because the world drives away the truth of the powerless to the margins, and we need to keep bringing it back to the center. So in the 52 years that have passed since Nakba, the great catastrophe, the Palestinian people have been squeezed increasingly into shrinking little slivers of land in the West Bank and Gaza. And the policies by which Palestinian land is taken over by Israel, there is a policy of home demolition. And there are, of course, military means, but I'm talking about the ways in which, in a routine civilian manner, Palestinian land is taken over. And home demolition includes both what is called punitive demolition, which is the demolition of the homes of families and neighborhoods of so-called or suspected terrorists. But there is something quite ferocious and evil is the word that springs to mind, called administrative demolition, which is done to enforce building codes and regulations which are laid out actually in Palestine, building codes in Palestine which are laid down by the Israeli military. And this, in effect, means that Jewish settlement is being enforced in the occupied territory, and homes are demolished, Palestinian homes are demolished if they are not within the zones that are permitted. And Palestinians can neither buy land nor get building permission. So basically they just get squeezed into the smaller slivers. They go live with families, they do whatever, they lose their homes. So in the 52 years, something like 600,000 Israeli citizens have been transferred to the occupied West Bank. And in these 52 years, Palestinians have been deprived of all civilian rights, of all civil rights, of all human rights. We would unfortunately find parallels in the fact that all nonviolent political activity is now criminalized. It's not now criminalized, it's now criminalized in India, but it has been criminalized in Israel for 52 years. And they have just no rights at all. So if you look at India now and what has been happening since May 2019, by abrogating Article 370 and by passing the CAA, India doesn't look very different from Israel today, because both of these acts disenfranchise in a similar way specific sections of the population, Kashmiris and Muslims. We also find a settlement policy. So, the kind of settlement policy that Israel has, we find the Indian government inaugurating a settlement policy in Kashmir by changing the domicile rules so that non-Kashmiris can move in, buy land and so on and settle down. And of course, it's very convenient that Hindu Rashtra and predatory capitalism both benefit by this, because you can buy land, you can use it for commercial purposes, forests can be destroyed, and so on. So the parallels between Israel and India, particularly since May 2019, and the CAA Act, as we know, is one that is specifically the first step towards the disenfranchisement of the Indian Muslim. And we can see the similarities very clearly.
Nivi, thank you so much for that overview. And with that in mind, let us now move to Achin. Achin, you have always maintained that Israel is unique. Could you elaborate on this? And also, especially in the light of what Nivi just said, how should we see the Israel-India relationship today?
There are two parts to your question, one about the uniqueness of Israel, and of course, the similarities, connections between India and Israel. And Nivi has very correctly pointed out how India, inspired by Israel in many ways, is doing the kind of things that Israel has been doing for some considerable time in Kashmir. And of course, the CAA, if you like, is an attempt to also make at least India, at least regionally, the exclusive natural home of Hindus, to the detriment of Muslims in India as second-class citizens and so on. So let me take the uniqueness of Israel. Israel is unique in 6 ways in the world. Number one, it has carried out the longest running illegal military occupation of modern history through forms of overt and covert violence in the whole history of modern world history. Second, it is the only country in the world that does not give a map defining its territorial borders to the UN. India and Pakistan both give maps to the UN claiming the whole of Kashmir, but India does not claim Rawalpindi, and Pakistan does not claim Amritsar or New Delhi. Israel deliberately does not define its borders so that it can continue to expand and justify that expansion. Third, no other country in the world has the same proportion of political prisoners in relation to population comparable to what Israel has. And in some years, it has in absolute numbers, the largest numbers of political prisoners. Fourth, do you know that Israel is the only country in the world that tries minors in military courts? This is incredible. Fifth, is there any country in the world that is so dishonest and so hypocritical and tries to pretend that it is suffering from dangers in the world? It is so assiduously dishonest. Listen to this. Israel has got a conventional force which is stronger than all the conventional forces of all the neighbors in the Arab world put together. It has nuclear weapons. In addition to this, as you pointed out, Pamela, about Saeed, it has the backing of the most powerful military power in the world, the United States of America. And it goes on and on and on about this myth of the perpetual victimhood of Israel. And sixth, and this is most important, do you know that Israel is the only country in the world which is not a state of its citizens? It is a state of the Jewish people. Even the Islamic State of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic State of Pakistan or anywhere else is not the state of all Muslims in the world. It is the Islamic State of Saudi citizens. It is the Islamic State of Pakistan, and so on. And this is where the point that Nivi made about how the CAA, in terms of trying to expand the arena of the natural home of Hindus, is imitating Israel, but at a more limited scale here. This is something incredible, and it's a testimony to the nature of Israel. As for the India-Israel relationship, yes, you have now a very strong and growing connection at the military level. Do not forget at the surveillance level, the recent Pegasus spyware, which an Israeli company sells only to governments, but was sold to the Indian government. And this Indian government, of course, simply said that WhatsApp should carry on with its investigation, and this is very bad, but cannot deny the fact that it has been using, it has got this spyware and is using it, etc. Incidentally, the negative relationship between India and the United States and Israel started with the Narasimhan Rao government, but the Modi government has, of course, reinforced this and extended this and deepened this here to a much greater extent. And you now have Israeli forces giving training to Indian police forces and others, and how to, in the name of fighting terrorism, carry out the most brutal kinds of actions against whoever it deems necessary, and so on. So you really have a very, very serious situation. Of course, what we should do about it is something else. But yes, this is the new kind of relationship. This is the kind of relationship that India and Israel has, and it's something that we have to, of course, oppose.
Thank you, Achin, for laying out the field so well. It is really a disturbing situation, and the scenario that is staring the world in its face is very dire, and one doesn't know how it's going to play out in the days ahead. Just to go to a slightly tangential point, but an important one nevertheless for our conversation today. Nivi, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the BDS, has proved remarkably effective in its efforts to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians. But a disturbing development of late, and it is very disturbing because we want that movement to carry on in full strength, is a manner in which those associated with it are being stigmatized in various ways.
Yes, you're right. It's I think an indicator of the success of BDS and its ethical power, because it's not it's not a massive movement with the kind of resources that Israel has, but its ethical force is very evident in the fact that it is being criminalized especially in the US, but also in Germany, which is, of course, dealing with its own troubled history and its link with Holocaust. And so I can give you two examples, for instance, of the way in which BDS is being targeted. In the US, many states have anti-boycott laws, which actually penalize businesses which refuse to do business with illegal businesses in illegal settlements in the West Bank. So these businesses in the US are penalized by the US government, by the US state governments, using anti-boycott laws. So they're basically penalizing businesses for being ethical and choosing whom they will do business with. In the case of Germany, it's a very complicated scenario, as you can imagine, because they've come out of a history of anti-Semitism, and so it is more complex. But nevertheless, a scholar of the stature of Achille Mbembe has been accused of anti-Semitism, but also of a peculiar what can I call it, crime called relativizing the Holocaust. Now, this is for supporting BDS, because Achin Vanaik has supported BDS and has written extensively in support of Palestine. To relativize the Holocaust is to say that the Holocaust is not a unique event in history, and to say that there have been other comparable acts against human beings, to say that it is not very different from the violence of imperialism, or to compare it to apartheid, to compare it to anything at all, and certainly to the dispossession of Palestinians. So to compare the Holocaust to any of these three is seen as relativizing the Holocaust and reducing its value. It has to remain unique. It has to remain the most important burden that any people have had to bear. So it's something that we will have to fight, and we will have to see if that kind of thing comes into India as well. I hope not. We'll have to fight it if so.
Thank you. Thank you, Nivi. We are coming towards the end of our discussion, and our thoughts go to the future. How do you see the future pan out, Achin? The future of Palestine and the future of the Palestinian-Indian relationship?
What's happened in the last 20 years is that more governments have shifted towards the Israeli government. But as if countering this, more and more people in civil societies around the world have come to see the justice of the Palestinian cause. And it is precisely because of this that you've had the development of a BDS movement, which worries so many of these governments, and of course the Israeli government, because it's testimony to the fact that you have more and more people seeing very clearly the apartheid character of Israel and its brutal and ugly character. And hence, of course, what Nivi was pointing out in terms of efforts from the top to try to do that. What of the future? Well, the tremendous asset that the Palestinians have, which the Israeli governments and pro-Israeli governments don't know what to do, is that generation after generation after generation, the people of Palestine are prepared to continue to fight for justice. It's incredible. It doesn't matter. Across so many generations, they just keep on fighting to struggle that. And they really, in many ways, don't know what to do. Can things change for the better? Most certainly, but it would require three things. Number one, it would require a change in the nature of the leadership of the Palestinian struggle. In both of these, a younger generation which recognizes that it has to break away from this kind of patronage link and which has to do certain things. It has to connect to the struggle of the Palestinians, not in the occupied territories, but also in the non-occupied territories of Israel. Remember, I said that Israel is the only country in the world which is not a state of its citizens. This means that Jews everywhere, once they come to Israel, have more rights than the Arab Palestinians living in Israel. This is why the point Nivedita made about the CAA, where if you have Hindus coming from the regional area, they will have more rights than Muslims in this country here. And that struggle by the Arab Palestinians for their rights, for their struggles, gets connected to the struggle of Palestinians in the occupied territories for their rights and struggles. And in this way moves towards a much more collective struggle. That is one. Second, of course, you pointed out, Saeed, and the shifty character of other governments in West Asia, North Africa, and so on. There's a difference between these governments and the public, ordinary public in those countries, which is very strongly pro-Palestinian. And it is necessary to make connections there. And let us be very clear, if there is one long-term successful overthrow of one of these autocracies, whether in Egypt or these princely kingdoms, Saudi Arabia, whatever, it will transform the picture dramatically on the regional level. And this is something that the United States, Israel, and all the others that are supportive are actually very scared of. Remember, Saudi Arabia has a very close connection to Israel. So the connection of the Palestinians to others fighting for greater democratization in their countries becomes a very, very important dimension. And lastly, the BDS. The BDS and the struggle in civil societies everywhere is a struggle which does not do that much material damage to the Israeli government, but does tremendous political moral damage. It's a kind of replay, if you like, of the BDS and against the South African apartheid system. And they realize its dangers. Because ultimately, as long as the Palestinian struggle for justice continues, and you are able to successfully move in the direction of trying to change the consciousness and thinking on the political moral level of people to recognize what Israel is, there is every chance of success. In the CAA movement here, something very interesting happened. And that is that in urban areas, young people across religious faiths came to defend democracy. Our job in India, as part of the BDS movement, is also to tap into that potential, to generate more support among young people against this general inhumanity of Israel and the question of rights which cut across nation states here. And let me just end by saying that Nelson Mandela was once asked, at what point did you know that you were going to succeed in your struggle against apartheid? And his answer was very straightforward. He said, we knew that we were going to defeat apartheid when we realized that we had captured the moral imagination of enough people. He didn't even say the majority of people. He said, when we have captured the moral imagination of enough people. Our job as those who support the Palestinian struggle outside of Palestine is to be part of that international struggle to transform, to capture the moral imagination of enough people to expose Israel for what it is, one of the ugliest apartheid countries in the world.
Thank you, Achin. Actually, that's a marvelous way to sign off this conversation, because in a sense, one has to remember the importance of Palestine for the world. It holds a certain moral challenge to all of us across the continents. And I think our conversation today was a small gesture to that challenge before us. At this point, I'll sign off. And now it's over to the second phase of this event, the amazing solidarity between India and Palestine that lives on in the work of artists, theater groups, activists, and intellectuals.
India and Palestine, in one sense, are connected at birth. India became independent in 1947, and Palestine, in some ways, became unindependent in 1948. But both were partitions. You know, in India there was a partition, and in Palestine there was a partition. And in both cases, it was the British, the colonial British power, that engineered this. In the winter of 2015 and 16, December to about end of January, we had an interesting visit. There were actors and a director from the Freedom Theatre in Palestine, which is a theatre based in the Jenin refugee camp in the north of the West Bank. And we had a group of about 8 people who came from there, and we made a play with them. And the play toured to several cities across India, to about 11, 12 cities, if I remember correctly, across India. This poster that you see right behind me is one of the posters for the entire tour. And this was a poster created by Orijit Sen. One of the things that we tried to do as part of this tour was to bring together artists who would be able to collaborate with the Freedom Theatre and with the tour in one way or the other. So there were several theatre artists who also got involved: Sunil Shanbag, Maya Rao, Neil Chaudhary, etc. You know, there were a whole lot of them, Anurupa Roy, and so on. So they came and did workshops with the students of the Freedom Theatre School, and my co-director was Faisal Abul Haija. So Faisal and I had co-directed this play, which was called Hamesha Samida. And this was a play that was about half an hour long. And it really was a kind of an introduction to Indian audiences of the situation in Palestine. What was interesting about the play is that half the cast was Indian, half the cast was Palestinian. And the Palestinian actors spoke in Arabic, the Indian actors spoke in Hindi. And wasn't as if they were translating each other. There was no translation, so therefore, it was fantastic how Indian audiences embraced this joint production. And it helped us to get the focus on the question of Palestine in India, and to focus on the idea that the Indian people and the Palestinian people, they have a shared struggle. Afterwards, in the spring of 2016, we as a company, the Natya Manch, also traveled to Palestine, and we put up our plays there in Hindi with some very basic translation that was more like subtitling, with placards that were held up in our hands. But also Orijit Sen, the artist who created this, traveled with us, and he was sketching, of course, through the entire journey, through the entire tour, but he also created 3 murals in different places in Palestine. One of them, the main mural that he created, is something that adorns the outside wall right outside the Freedom Theater of Jenin.
That fellow with his hands behind his back is called Handala. He's a character created by a Palestinian cartoonist called Naji Ali. The Palestinian right to return to the homes that they had to abandon in 1948, that they were forced out of in 1948. And you'll see the key motive appearing in murals everywhere. These are just, initially I'm showing you a few examples of murals that exist in the refugee camps and other places. So this is obviously a local martyr in a refugee camp near Bethlehem. Okay, I was traveling and sketching. There was one more artist with me, and he was also a big sketching fan or whatever. He had his own sketchbooks. In fact, on the very first night, we were in this room with the bunk beds, and I had fallen asleep, and he arrived. And I was woken up because he got up on the bunk on top of me, and he was making a hell of a lot of racket, and I was getting pissed off. And then suddenly his bag fell down from above and landed with a crash. And I looked, and his bag had opened, and there were paint bottles and brushes and everything spattered all over the ground. So then immediately I didn't feel angry with him anymore. This is Faisal, who I was talking about a bit earlier. So that's him, Tim, the other artist. This is so we collaborated on a couple of murals in Fasail, and then later in a town called Aktumani. One is in the community center and one in a school.
So the connection between Natya Manch and the Freedom Theater happened soon after Giuliano Mercanis, who was one of the founders of the Freedom Theater. He was assassinated, and then we reached out to them, and because we also have a history of one of our founders, Safdar Hashmi, being killed, so that kind of became a kind of an emotional bonding between the two groups.
I also drew Safdar and Giuliano, the two founders of the two theaters, on one side of the tree, and so this is while I was drawing the two figures, and this is the finished thing. It says the past will also be present in the future. I integrated the tree itself into the tree overhanging from the wall into the mural, and there's Safdar and Giuliano on one side of the tree. The tree itself is like the tree of resistance, and it has Handala, it has a small shrine to Handala. So the resistance is like the present, and Giuliano and Safdar is the history that informs this presence, the present. And what we see on the other side of the tree is the future of free Palestine with the sea and children. And the bands of the Palestinian flag are breaking into, the top black band is breaking into keys, and the white band is breaking into doves, and the green band is breaking into olive leaves.
What was also interesting about the tour at a larger level is that this was a tour that was worked out entirely between the Palestinians and us. There was no funding agency or there was no other agency involved, particularly nothing from the first world. The entire funding and everything was locally generated. In other words, we generated the funding for the expenses in India. They generated the funding for the expenses that meant that they could travel to India. But the project itself was not funded by anyone. we didn't have to acknowledge anyone. So therefore, on this poster, for instance, you don't see a single logo. And that's unusual for for an international collaboration of any kind, but particularly in the arts. Very unusual to have a poster without a single logo.
So we witnessed this brilliant conversation between Orijit and Sudhanva just now, talking about cultural collaboration. And this is really one of the most important elements of how we are trying to build the solidarity here in India. We also want to take this occasion to thank all of you for joining us in this event, even if not during the live event, which we couldn't work out. But I hope you watched this video and enjoyed what we put together and would continue to work with us in building this true internationalism of Palestine solidarity. Aparna?
Yeah, we will now finally end with watching Jana to Manch performing excerpts from their poetry on and for Palestine titled Ujle Safed Kabutar, which showcases poems of the Palestinian national poet Mahmoud Darwish, Adania Shibli, and Nizar Kabbani.
In Palestine, my watch often stops moving. It suddenly enters into a coma, unable to count time. On my last visit there, I set it as usual to local time the minute the plane touched down at the airport. It was 10 to 2 in the afternoon. I headed towards passport control. There weren't many travelers, and the line I stood in was proceeding quickly. I handed my passport over to the police officer, and she took her time looking at it. Then more time. Suddenly, 2 men and a woman appeared, a mix of police, security, and secret services. They took me out of the line and began a long process of questioning and searches. Everything proceeded as usual in such situations. An exhaustive interrogation into the smallest details of my life and a thorough search of my belongings. Afterwards, I was led into a room for a body search, and while one woman walked away with my shoes and belt to the X-ray room, another stayed behind with my watch, which she held inside her palm. Contemplating it with intent and devotion. After a few minutes, she looked at her watch, then back at mine, again at her watch, then at mine. When the first woman came back with the rest of my belongings, she hurried over to her to tell her that there was something strange about my watch. It was not moving. 5 minutes had passed according to her watch, whereas according to mine, none had. They called the security chief, and my heart started to bang violently in my chest. I didn't know how much time had passed before my watch and then I were cleared of all suspicions and allowed to leave. But I discovered when I reached home that it was 9 o'clock in the evening, while my watch was still pointing to 10 to 2 in the afternoon. Perhaps my watch was trying to comfort me by making me believe that all that searching and delay had lasted 0 minutes, that nothing had happened. Or perhaps it simply refuses to count the time that is seized from my life, time whose only purpose is to humiliate me and drive me to despair. A suspension of time that is intended for the obstruction of pain.
यहाँ पहाड़ियों की ढलानों पर टूटी परछाइयों के बागानों के पास सांझ और समय की तोपों के मुकाबिल हम वो करते हैं जो कैदी किया करते हैं या बेरोजगार। हम उम्मीद बोते हैं।
पौ फटने की कगार पर एक देश, हम बौरा गए हैं क्योंकि हम जीतने पर आमादा हैं। गोलीबारी से रोशन हमारी रातों में कोई रात नहीं। हमारे दुश्मन चौकस हैं, वो करते हैं रोशनी हमारे लिए तहखानों की स्याही में।
चुटपुटे के वक्त आसमान भारी है, सीसई, रात में उग्र, नारंगी।
जहां तक दिलों की बात है, वो बाढ़ के फूलों की तरह हैं, तटस्थ। सैनिक मापते हैं जिंदगी और मौत के बीच की दूरी एक टैंक की दूरबीन से,
और हम मापते हैं गोले और हमारे बदन के बीच की दूरी अंदाज से।
तुम जो दहलीज पर खड़े हो, भीतर आओ, हमारे साथ अरबी कॉफी पियो और शायद तुम महसूस करो तुम भी हमारी तरह इंसान हो।
तुम जो घरों की दहलीज पर खड़े हो, हमारी सुबहों से बाहर जाओ, हम भी आश्वस्त हों कि हम तुम्हारी तरह इंसान हैं। हम मनोरंजन के लिए समय निकाल ही लेते हैं, ताश खेलते हैं या अखबार के पन्ने खोलते हैं कल के घायलों की खबर के लिए, और राशिफल के कॉलम पढ़ते हैं। वर्ष 2002 में तस्वीरें छपती हैं उनकी जो पैदा हुए घेरेबंदी की राशि में।
जब लड़ाकू विमान ओझल हो जाते हैं, उजले सफेद कबूतर झाड़ते हैं आसमान के गालों को पंख फैला, वापस लाते हैं चमक, छा जाते हैं अंतरिक्ष और करतबों पर, ऊंचे और ऊंचे उड़ान भरते हैं। उजले सफेद कबूतर।
काश कि आसमान असली होता।
यूं कहा एक राहगीर ने मुझसे 2 बमबारियों के बीच के वक्फे में।
सैनिकों के पीछे सदाबहार साइप्रस के दरख्तों की कतारें, आकाश को सिमटने से रोकती मीनारें, और लोहे की बाड़ के पीछे पेशाब करते सैनिक टैंक की सुरक्षा में। और यूं पतझड़ का दिन अपनी सुनहरी चहलकदमी खत्म करता है संडे मास के बाद सूने गिरजा जैसी एक सुनसान गली में। एक कातिल से,
अगर तुमने अपने शिकार का चेहरा देखा होता और एक पल विचारा होता, तुम्हें अपनी मां याद आती गैस चेंबर में, और तुम नकार देते बंदूक का राज और बदल लेते अपनी सोच। ये तो कोई ढंग नहीं अपनी पहचान बनाने का। एक और कातिल से,
अगर तुमने भ्रूण को 30 दिन और छोड़ दिया होता, संभावनाएं बदल जाती, कब्जा शायद खत्म हो जाता और दुधमुहे बच्चे को याद न रहता घेरेबंदी का समय, और वो एक तंदुरुस्त बच्चे की तरह बढ़ता, जवां होता और एशिया के कदीमी इतिहास की तालीम पाता उसी मकतब में जिसमें तुम्हारी एक बेटी पढ़ती। ऐन मुमकिन है कि दोनों इश्क में होते गिरफ्तार और उनकी होती एक लड़की जो कि जन्म से होती यहूदी। तो देखो तुमने क्या किया। अब तुम्हारी बेटी है बेवा, तुम्हारी नाते ना नात। ये क्या किया तुमने अपने क्षणजीवी कुनबे के साथ? एक ही तीर से 3-3 फाख्ता मार गिराए।
हमारे नुकसान 2 से 8 शहीद रोजाना और 10 घायल और 20 घर और 50 जैतून के पेड़, अलावा उन विरंचनात्मक त्रुटियों के, स्ट्रक्चरल फ्लॉज के, जो कविता, नाटक और अधूरी तस्वीरों में उभरती रहती हैं।
एक औरत ने बादल से कहा, मेरे महबूब को ढक लो, मेरे महबूब को ढक लो, मेरे कपड़े तरबतर हैं उसके खून से।
अगर तुम बरसात नहीं हो मेरे प्यारे, तो एक पेड़ होना, उर्वरा शक्ति से भरपूर पेड़ होना। अगर तुम पेड़ नहीं हो मेरे प्यारे, तो एक पत्थर होना, नमी से सराबोर एक पत्थर होना। अगर तुम पत्थर नहीं हो मेरे प्यारे, तो चांद होना, महबूबा की नींद में चांद होना।
यूं कहा एक मां ने अपने बेटे से उसके जनाजे में। मैं अपनी आज़ादी को कैसे कबूलता हूं, वो मुझे कैसे कबूलती है। कहाँ रहेंगे हम निकाह के बाद? सुबह उठकर क्या मैं उसे कहूँगा, क्या तुम सोई मेरी बगल में जैसे तुम सोती हो? इस ज़मीं के आसमान के सपने देखते हुए तुम्हें तकलीफ तो नहीं हुई? क्या तुम नींद से उठी सलामत? क्या तुम मेरे साथ चाय पियोगी या कॉफ़ी दूध वाली? तुम फलों का रस पसंद करोगी या मेरे बोसे? कैसे आज़ाद करूं अपनी आज़ादी को? ओ अजनबी, मैं तुम्हारा अजनबी नहीं, ये बिस्तर है तुम्हारा बिस्तर। उन्मुक्त रहो, आज़ाद, अंतहीन, और मेरे बदन को छितरा दो पंखुड़ी पंखुड़ी अपने बाहुपाश में। मेरी आज़ादी, मुझे अपना आदि बना दो, मुझे भावातीत कर दो ताकि हम दोनों एक हो जाएं। मैं कैसे उसे कबूलूं, वो मुझे कैसे कबूले? मैं कैसे बनूं उसका मालिक जबकि हूं मैं उसका गुलाम? कैसे करूं आज़ाद अपनी आज़ादी को बिना उससे बिछड़े? वो पूछता है, कौन से फूल पसंद है तुम्हें?
वो कहती है, कार्नेशन काले।
वो पूछता है, तुम मुझे कहाँ ले जा रही हो जबकि कार्नेशन काले हैं?
वो कहती है, मेरे भीतर जो रोशनी की जगह है वहां, और उससे भी आगे और आगे और आगे। शहीद ने मुझे सबक दिया,
मेरी आज़ादी से बढ़कर कोई सौंदर्य बोध नहीं।
शहीद ने मुझे चेताया,
औरतों के ब्याह गीत पर यकीन मत करो, मेरे पिता पर यकीन करो जब वे आंसू भरी निगाहों से मेरी तस्वीर देखते हैं। तुमने किरदार कैसे बदल दिया मेरे बेटे, और मुझसे पहले चले गए। पहले मैं पहले।
शहीद कहता है,
मत चलो मेरे जनाजे में अगर मुझसे तारुफ ना हो। तकल्लुफ की जरूरत नहीं मुझे।
लेखन एक पिल्ला है, हवा में मुंह मारता हुआ। लेखन घाव करता है बिना जख्म किए।
सलाम, सलाम उसे जिसके साथ साझा है मेरा पैमाना। इस गाढ़ी रात में जो छलकती है दो बाजू, सलाम मेरी रूह को।
सलाम कहता है एक मुसाफिर अपने से, उस ओर के दूसरे मुसाफिर से।
सलाम, अमन, सलाम।
अमन है एक गहरी दरार के किनारे, दो अजनबियों के फाख्ताओं का एक दूसरे से आखिरी गुटरगू।
अमन है दो प्रेमियों की चांदनी में नहाने की चाह।
अमन है ताकतवर का माफीनामा उनको जिनके हथियार तो कमजोर हैं पर मार गहरी।
अमन है तलवार का टूट जाना ऐसी खूबसूरती के सामने जहां शबनम लोहा पिघलाती है। अमन है वो दोस्ताना दिन, मनभावन, चपल, किसी का दुश्मन नहीं।
अमन है सच का खुला इकबाल। क्या किया तुमने मकतूल की रूह से?
अमन है एक नौजवान की आह, एक नौजवान जिसका दिल जख्मी है एक औरत की खूबसूरती की छाप से, गोली या बम से नहीं।
अमन है जिंदगी का राग, यहाँ अभी गेहूं की बाली के तार पर।
अमन है जिंदगी का राग, यहाँ अभी गेहूं की बाली के तार पर।
इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, गर मुहाफिज हैं हम गुलाब के और एक औरत के और एक जसीम छंद के और आसमान के आसमानी रंग के। एक मुल्क जहां कुछ भी बचा ना बाकी, ना पानी ना पवन ना डाची ना डेरा और गूढ़ी अरबी कॉफी तक नहीं। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, गर बयां की एक तबाह वतन की बात या एक बेदम तहस नहस वतन की तबाही। एक वतन जिसका पता न ठिकाना, एक मुल्क जिसका नाम भी ना। एक वतन जहां अखबारें पढ़ना हराम, खबरें सुनना हराम, परिंदों का चहचहाना भी हराम। एक वतन जहां दहशत का मारा शायर आदी है बेवास्ता लिखने को। एक वतन जो हमारे वतन की शायरी की तरह है एक शेखी, बेतुकी बेगानी। एक मक्कार चेहरा और जुबान, ना आगाज ना अंजाम, ना आवामी सरोकार, ना मिट्टी का प्यार, ना इंसानी अजाब। एक मुल्क जो मांगता है खैर बिना पगड़ी नंगे पैर। एक मुल्क जहां मर्दों की भीगी पतलून और अस्मत बचाती खातून। आंखों में नमक, आंखों में नमक, होठों में नमक, लफ्जों में नमक। कैसे इतनी खुश्की ढूंढूं ऐ खुदा। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, गर मरने से किया इनकार इजरायली बुलडोजरों के नीचे, जो कुचल रहे हैं हमारी जमीन, हमारी तारीख, हमारे पाक लफ्ज, हमारी कुरान, हमारे नबियों की कब्रें। गर ये गुनाह है तो देखो लोगों, कितनी हसीन है दहशतगर्दी। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, जो मिट जाने से किया इनकार मंगोलों, यहूदियों और बर्बरों के हाथों, जो फेंका एक पत्थर सलामती काउंसिल के शीश महल पर, जिसे तानाशाहों के सरताज ने अपने लिए हड़प लिया है। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, जो इनकार किया सौदेबाजी का भेड़िए के साथ, जो परहेज हाथ मिलाने से भड़ुए के साथ। अमेरिका लोगों की तहजीब के खिलाफ बद तहजीब, बाशऊरों के शऊर के खिलाफ बेशऊर। अमेरिका एक ढांचा शानदार बिना दीवार। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, गर मुहाफिज हैं हम अपनी जमीन की मिट्टी के अस्मत के। गर आवाज उठाई लोगों के बलात्कार के खिलाफ, अपने बलात्कार के खिलाफ। गर मुहाफिज हैं हम अपने सहरा के, खजूर के आखिरी दरख्त के, अपने आसमान के आखिरी तारे के, अपने नाम के आखिरी हर्फ के, अपनी मां के दूध की आखिरी बूंद के। गर ये सब गुनाह हैं तो कितनी हसीन है दहशतगर्दी। इल्जाम हमारे सर दहशतगर्दी का, गर हिफाजत की पूरी ताकत के साथ अपने शायराना विरसे की, अपनी कौमी दीवार की, सुर्ख सभ्याचार की, पहाड़ियों में गूंजती बांसुरियों की अपनी तहजीब की, और उस शीशे की जिससे काली आंख बनी है। मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। अगर वो आजाद करती है लोगों को जालिम के जुल्म से और बचा सकती है इंसान को इंसान के सितम से, अगर वो लौटा सकती है नींबू और जैतून के दरख्त और परिंदे जुनूबी लेबनान को और लौटा सकती है मुस्कान गोलान को, मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। जब तक दुनिया का नया निजाम बटा है आधा आधा अमेरिका और इजराइल के बीच, मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं, अपनी शायरी के साथ, अपने लफ्जों के साथ, अपने दांतों के साथ, जब तक ये नई दुनिया है कसाईयों के साथ। मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। अगर अमरीकी सेनेट तय करती है फैसले, इनाम और सजा, मैं इरहाब के साथ हूं। जब तक नई दुनिया का निजाम नफरत करता है अरब की बू से, मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। जब तक नई दुनिया का निजाम मेरे बच्चों के टुकड़े टुकड़े कर फेंकता है कुत्तों के आगे। और इसलिए मैं अपनी आवाज बुलंद करता हूं। मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं। मैं दहशतगर्दी के साथ हूं।